At the end of part one on the Euthyphro, we saw that Euthyphro, though confident, was actually very confused about the nature of piety once he was questioned by Socrates. And so at this point, Socrates suggests a new path, right? He pursues a different route. Maybe this is a way to get at piety, to ask the question, what's the relation between piety and justice? And there are a few different options here. Is it one of equality? Are they actually the same thing? Or maybe is one a subset of the other? So you could think of this in a couple ways. You could think of this as the J arrow P there, justice implies piety. So if something's just, then it is pious. Or you could think of it as the other relationship, second relationship here, is piety. Does that imply justice? So that if something is pious, then it definitely is just. Or the third relationship symbolized here, is piety the same as justice? Is something pious if and only if it is also just? Is it one of these relationships? And it seems that piety is a subset of justice. That's what it seems like. So it seems like things that are pious are always just. The second relationship described there. But following that route leads to more questions. Now, if the arrows and the symbolization and the implication discussion didn't help, let's try to make this very clear. So the question was, is everything that is just something that is pious? This would be, does justice imply piety? And that was concluded that it was not that relationship. Here's the relationship that they thought that it made sense. Is everything that is pious just? Does piety imply justice? And so that seems to be the acceptable relationship. And of course, then they denied that they are the same thing, that one implies the other and vice versa. So after that, that kind of got the relation between the two settled. However, we still don't have the nature of piety. So there is a fourth proposal by Euthyphro. He says, the pious is care of the gods. Now this prompted a question from Socrates, because care of seems to imply that you are going to make something better, like a horse trainer cares for horses and makes them better, right? But that implies a problem here. We do not make the gods better. It's not like we care for them to make them better, to improve the gods. That doesn't seem to make any sense. And so Euthyphro says, well, it's not really care of in that sense. It's more like service to the gods. And then the question arises, well, service. So when you serve someone, you're trying to accomplish something for them. So to what aim are we trying to service the God? What are we trying to accomplish? What is pious? And Euthyphro says, yes, but right now we have the problem that piety is that which brings about piety. So that's circular. That doesn't help us understand piety. And so Euthyphro modifies this just a little bit more. He says, no, it's trading with the gods. So it's a give and take. It's begging and sacrificing. You sacrifice something, you ask the gods for something, and that's piety, being involved with those things. So the idea here is that sacrifice is what pleases the gods, right? Is that what we mean here? That what we want to do is please the gods by sacrifice? And Euthyphro says, yes, absolutely, that's what's pious. The pious is what the gods love. But wait a minute, wasn't that the very first proposal we were considering? The pious is what the gods love. We've already been down this road, right? We've already seen the problems with this kind of response. So Euthyphro has not answered Socrates' question, and it's Euthyphro that seems like daedalus, right? if you're not familiar with Daedalus, he's said to be an ancestor of Socrates, who was a sculptor, and he was so proficient at his work. His sculptures were so lifelike that when you bought one, you had to tie it down. Otherwise, it would get up at night and run away, right? So the analogy there is that the ideas are running around and you can't nail them down. And Euthyphro and others have accused Socrates of being like Daedalus because his ideas seem to run around. But of course, it's typically the other person, in this case, Euthyphro, who's more like that. And his ideas are the ones that seem to have run around but never found a home. All right, so what should we say about Socrates' views on this topic of piety? Socrates is willing to accept that the gods, or God singular, do not serve as moral authorities. They're not moral authorities, right? Socrates, and Plato especially, is fine by identifying an impersonal form of goodness. And in the Republic, we'll see this, right? The ultimate form, the form of goodness. That's the ultimate standard for morality. And the gods actually have to look to it as the moral authority. So the gods aren't moral authorities. So ultimately, Socrates believes that it's more plausible to think that the gods love things because they are pious. That's the way to answer his question proposed to Euthyphro, the Euthyphro question. And that leaves the standards of goodness as objective. Now, I would raise one criticism at this point. Socrates assumes that you can't have it both ways, this causal explanation of what something is. So he assumes that, right, if you have something that has Q-ness, so it's cued because of cueing, but you have something else that is also cued, but it has R-ness, and it's cued though because it has R-ness. So these two things cannot be the same thing. It can't be that R-ness is the same thing as Q-ness. So Socrates seems to use this principle, right? But let's think of this a little more carefully. What about the example of circleness? Or, yes, we have a standard word in English, circularity. Because, so something has circleness because it is a figure with all points equidistant from the center. Okay, that's a true statement, and that makes sense. It explains why that figure has circleness or circularity, because it has all points equidistant from the center. But we could also say that something has this quality of being a figure with all points equidistant from the centerness because it is a circle. Okay, that makes sense also, right? Why does it have that characteristic? Because it's a circle. But having circularity is the same thing as being a figure with all points equidistant from the centerness, right? So these two are the same thing in this case. They don't follow that presumption that Socrates had. Now, why is this significant? Well, it's significant because there is a contemporary version of the Euthyphro question, or the Euthyphro problem, and the dilemma is set up like this against monotheism and God's relationship to ethics, moral standards. So we have something like this. If something is good, morally good, because God loves it, then goodness seems to be arbitrary. If we take that path of the explanation, then it seems like God could love anything, but that would make it good. So if God loved murder, then that would make it good, right? And that makes morality entirely relative to whatever God prefers. This is a theological relativism, and this is something that most theists would reject, right? That you don't want this relativism if you're a theist, typically speaking. But think of it the other direction then. If God loves things because they are good, then it seems like he must appeal to a standard of goodness apart from God. So that seems to be problematic because now it's not God who is the moral authority, right? He has to look at some standard of goodness apart from himself. Now, some theists don't think that this path is a problem. Some theists say, well, there's a standard of goodness just like there's a standard of logic, and God can't violate the principles of logic, and God can't violate the standards of goodness, so it's not a big deal. But here's a potential response, right? A possible response to address the dilemma that was set forth is that the ultimate good is identical with God. It just is God. And if that's the case, then we can say that something is good because God approves of it or commands it or wills it, depending on the version the person develops. That seems to be Euthyphro's side, right? His initial question, the initial response to the question. But it could also be true, if that's the case, that God approves of something because it's good, the side that Socrates took, right? If the ultimate good is God, then you could answer both questions with a yes, right? So is it the fallacy of confusing cause and effect? This seems to be the challenge brought forth here. So it goes something like this. Well, A causes B and B causes A, but that doesn't make any sense, right? You're confusing cause and effect in one of those cases. Could there be a situation where both of these things are true? Well, yes. You can say that the object is a circle because it has all points equidistant from the center. You can also say that the object has all points equidistant from the center because it is a circle. So this challenge is not really a problem after all. One more example here, the St. Louis Arch. So the south side remains up because the north side supports it. And the north side stays up because the south side supports it. Both of those are true. Just one more explanation here that can go either way. I breathe because I'm living, and I'm living because I breathe, right? In both of the items in the pairs, for all three of these, are true claims. And the affirmation of one does not imply the denial of the other. You can say both of these things. So you can say something is good because God approves it, and at the same time, God approves of something because it's good. How can you say that? If you identify the good, the ultimate good, as God. And so I do this in my hey, how's it going?
Not too bad.
Yeah.
Are you?
Finishing up a video.
Yeah.
Or the St. Louis Arch. So the south side remains up because the north side supports it. But it's also true that the north side stays up because the south side supports it. They both can be true. One final example here, I breathe because I'm living, and I'm living because I breathe. These are all possibilities that make sense when you think of one thing causing another. It can explain why something is true. So in each of these pairs, both are true claims, right? The affirmation of the one does not imply the denial of the other. And so it makes sense to say, if God is identified as the ultimate good, that God loves something or approves of something because it's good, but it's also true that it's good because God approves it. So they both can be true. And I developed that idea in an article I wrote that's in Phil Christie. So you can look up that article if you're interested in more information about this.